Hello class, this is Mrs. Politsky, and I've got notes for World History, Chapter 14, Section 4, Challenges of the Late Middle Ages. As we go along, make sure you complete your notes, and if you're receiving this via Google Form, make sure that you complete the questions when you are finished and submit. Here we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about the latter part of the Middle Ages here. And during the late Middle Ages, friars were able to fight heresy more effectively than monks were. Because friars lived among the people in the cities and could relate to the people and teach them, while monks were kind of tied up in the monasteries. Speaking of the church, Pope Clement V moved the papacy for a time from from Rome to France because he was French and he wanted to escape some of the civil wars that were disrupting Italy. And we had all those little papal states in the Italian peninsula that were kind of fighting amongst one another. And what ends up happening is we moved the papacy entirely to France for a number of years. To describe the papacy's exile in France, the name the Babylonian captivity was given. And sometimes this was known kind of as a schism or a schism in the church. The Great Schism came about when Roman mobs were forced the cardinals to elect an Italian pope, who then resigned when the cardinals declared the election invalid and elected another pope. So if you're kind of paying attention here, at one point in time we roughly had three popes that were staking claim to the Catholic Church. Uh, at some point in time, we are going to restore the papacy back to Rome after those civil wars quiet down. But it certainly did concern a lot of people that that you could have this kind of a situation occur. Speaking of other occurrences, during the late part of the Middle Ages, we had an event known as the 100 Years' War, or the Hundred Years' War. This was a war between France and England that grew out of a dispute for land. The Hundred Years' War began when King Edward III claimed sovereignty over all of England and France back in AD 1337. And some of this is going back to the fact that if you go back to the time of William the Conqueror, he was a Norman and, he spoke French, even though he was King of England. There were those who believed that land on the mainland continent of Europe really belonged to um, the English for the most part because of that tie to William. So, going back to Edward III, he believed that he was the rightful heir to the French throne. Not only that, but also to the throne of England. France declared that its former king's regent, King Philip VI, was heir to the throne and thus was the new king. So, in all, we're going to have to go to war. And war they did. They fought for numbers of years, sometimes the English getting the upper hand, at other times the French. During all this warfare, we had some new technical advantages that came up. The two major technological developments of the Hundred Years' War were the longbows and cannons. They became very effective in warfare. On a side note, there's also the story of Joan of Arc. Um, Joan of Arc was a young woman. She was roughly about age 14 when she, at one point in time, took charge of the French army. It kind of goes back to a vision that she had had. She had been drawing water from a well and had heard uh, from the voices of St. Michael, St. Margaret, and St. Catherine, who told her to stop what she was doing and to go lead France to victory. And she did. She approached the king at that time, King Charles, I believe the seventh, and had asked if she would be given an opportunity to lead the troops. Charles, hearing that she was coming, had kind of came up with some type of way to see if she was legitimate, and so he had one of his men dress as him. And what was interesting is Joan went into this room, the fake king on the throne and the real king to the side, and rather than going to the fake king, she actually went to who was really Charles, which was pretty remarkable considering she was just a farm girl and probably wasn't really well educated. And the fact that she, in a sense, knew who was the right one to talk to kind of was a sign to those people who were in the monarchy at that time. So, nevertheless, Joan leads her army, and they have a great victory at the Battle of Orleans. Unfortunately, at some point in time, English forces eventually are going to get the upper hand, and Joan is going to be, in a sense, betrayed by her own Frenchmen. And at some point in time, she will be handed over to the English, who think that she's a witch, and eventually she will be burnt at the stake. Nevertheless, the Hundred Years' War actually wasn't 100 years. It actually was more than that. It lasted from 1337 to 1453. And when it ended, the French had forced the English out of the country, and France maintained their monarchy, and England maintained its monarchy. And as far as a rivalry between the two nations, that would continue for years to come. But that's not all the drama there was. Some people say that kind of as a result of the Hundred Years' War, this is going to beget another war that's going to take place, but primarily one that's going to divide the nation of England or the country of England. The War of the Roses, which is kind of complicated, but to try to explain it, it was really a battle of who was the legitimate king of England. You had a battle between the House of York, led by a man named Edward IV, and eventually Richard III, and I'll talk about them here in a second, and the House of Lancaster, led by Henry Tudor. The House of York and Edward IV. Edward, at some point in time, is going to die, and there are some questions about who should be the king of England. Edward, just so you know, was the first king of the House of York. And there were some in Parliament that thought that, he wasn't really a legitimate ruler. And so when he dies, he has two sons, one 12, one 9, very young. And so the oldest, the 12-year-old, Edward V, becomes king, but he's only king for, about 3 months. And at that time, Parliament declared that he was an illegitimate ruler. Not only him, but his little brother was too. And so instead, they allow Richard III, who is Edward IV's youngest brother, to become king. Richard III takes his young nephews and imprisons them in the Tower of London. And for the most part, they're not seen again. He would lead England and he would fight the House of Lancaster. And the ultimate battle comes at a place called the Battle of Bosworth. Richard goes against Henry VII, or Henry Tudor, and at that battle, Richard III is killed. Richard would go down in English history as probably one of the least liked uh, monarchs. And at some point in time, he's going to be buried. And in recent news, he has been found, or his body was found under a parking lot back in 2012. And in the last year or so, he was re-entombed and given more of a stately funeral. But the question lies is where does this whole idea of the House of Roses or the War of Roses come from? And it comes from the symbols. The House of York was symbolized by white roses, and the House of Lancaster was symbolized by red roses. This is a painting that kind of depicts that, and people would pick their allegiance by picking certain colors of roses. So if you were a supporter of the House of York, like these men over here, you'd have your white roses, and if you were a supporter of the House of Lancaster, you'd have your red roses. All right, not to be taught by wars, but we got to talk about pandemics, the Black Death. If things going to get worse, they've just gotten even worse, I guess. Uh, Black Death was a deadly plague that perhaps was a combination of the bubonic and the uh, pneumonic plagues that killed about or as many as 25 million people and caused the medieval manorial system to fall apart. Merchant ships are believed to have spread the plague in that rats carrying infected fleas bit soldiers or sailors and spread the disease to distant ports. One of the things that you may notice here, you kind of see this kind of Birdman getup. A lot of people didn't know a lot about the spread of disease, but they did know that in some cases, being around some of the victims was not necessarily a great thing. And so you started seeing people who were either doctors or people who were working with the dead donning these masks as a way to kind of filter the air that they were breathing. And in a sense, it looks kind of spooky if you start thinking about it. To kind of wrap up here, um, the sick were often not treated, and that doctors and priests who tended to the sick typically caught the plague and died. And in the end, about one-third of Europe's population died as a result of Black Death. As you can kind of see, areas near the Mediterranean Sea probably were the hardest hit. And as you head kind of north or inland, maybe not as many people impacted. When we talk about this region, we're talking a little bit of what is today present day Germany and Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic and Poland. All right, thank you very much.